All right, test, test, test.
Like, you know,
I know. I probably shouldn't play any music. If I play music, YouTube's gonna be like, "What are you doing? Let's take this down." I gotta figure out the whole music thing because theoretically I can get some royalty-free music or something. I don't want to have to spend any money on it because I am just getting this thing started. I bet you guys can hear me, and it's being recorded too. Um, so let's just do this. Welcome everybody. Um, I'm sure nobody's here yet, but if you are with me, or if you have are watching this after the fact, I bid you welcome. I'm trying to, before I get actually started here, trying to see if I can find a link to this so I can post it on YouTube. Um, let's see here. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. There we go. All right. Let me post this, not on you. I'm going to post this link on Facebook onto my page just to see if maybe I can get some people to tune in here. All right. Okay. Anyway, I don't know who all will tune into this or be interested in this. Um, this is just an experiment. It's not really an experiment. I did a live stream a couple weeks ago where I talked about some stuff. But today I am answering a challenge. I was listening to recent episode by Dave Smith, part of the problem. Episode number 813. Title is "The State, a Coup, and You." And he got through the main. I don't know if you've watched a lot of Dave Smith. You know he'll do this. He'll have a topic. He'll talk about it for like half the episode, and then like the second half of the episode, it'll just be him driving home some of the stuff he normally talks about. Not like he's repetitive or boring or anything, but just like he kind of gets off the main topic back onto like other issues that are going on, and he'll maybe start talking about war or something. But the main topic of the podcast was just kind of more stuff about January 6th. But then he towards probably about 25 minutes in or so, he addresses a recent debate he had with Spike Cohen on the Lions of Liberty podcast. And it was the topic of the debate was borders. And you'll see here in a minute what he says here, the challenge he lays down. And so I'm gonna take the challenge here because he is wrong. I have to say I have not listened to the debate, so I'm not actually sure what Spike said. I'm not sure what Spike's argument was, so I can't necessarily say I'm taking Spike's side on this. And I also will have to say that even though Dave is wrong, I think he's right on some important things. Um, and you'll see as we get into it here. But this is the immigration debate is one that's been, oh man, it's one that's bugged me for several years because it was kind of it was around 2017 or so when the Reformed Libertarians split, and a bunch of those guys went more conservative, abandoning the whole ANCAP thing, and one of the issues of the day at the time seemed to be open borders. I remember there was some controversy between Larkin Rose and Hans Hoppe over the issue, and it's one where I kind of don't fall in either camp. Um, exactly, because I think we make a mistake. Um, we can make a mistake if we're not careful. Those of us who take the more of a Hoppe and ANCAP position, which is where I am on most things. So, but we can make a mistake, I think, if we are not careful enough in understanding the other side too much. I think it's easy to accidentally lump people who are pro open borders in together, and so I think that would include kind of myself to a certain extent because I am both open and closed borders, and so I just kind of wanted to take the opportunity that Dave Smith sort of opened up and see if I could like lay out my thoughts on it. So like before I get started, I have to say, I love Dave Smith. He's he's like probably the best, most consistent voice out there. I mean, Tom Woods is awesome, and there are several others. Scott Horton, you can't go wrong with. There are many great voices out there in libertarianism, but Dave Smith, I don't know, for some reason, just seems to have a very down to earth way of bringing issues home. And as far as like my agreement with him on a lot of things, I'm very close on so many things. Obviously, he is not there on spiritual matters, and I would love to. I'm interested, very much interested in some of the developments that have come out recently, like in his personal life, that are making him like think spiritual thoughts and everything. And I would love to see him begin to, hear more of the gospel. So, Dave, if you watch this at all, I'd love to talk to you about how Jesus Christ is the Savior. But my main thing right now is just say, as far as like as a liberty guy, he's probably the best one out there, or at least one of my favorite ones out there. I do have to say to anybody who's viewing this from the Christian Reformed world, if you're not familiar with Dave Smith, he's an unbeliever, and he has so he does not bridle his tongue when it comes to certain words. So you're going to hear some language that might offend you, and I apologize for that. I'm not going to censor anything or filter anything here, just because I'm too lazy for that. But also, I don't think that's fair to Dave to necessarily filter him out or anything. So we're just going to get into this, and we'll see where this goes. So, let me switch over here. I hope I've caveated everything. So anyway, so here's this is in his episode here. He's going to get into it a little bit here. He's kind of preambled a little bit here, but he's going to lay out the challenge here and give us what his argument is. So I'm just going to play it here for a little bit, and then I'll see if I can break in and talk about where I think he's wrong. So here we go.
I've heard from some of them on Twitter, although I gotta say it is a minority, a solid minority of the people who listened to the debate who are like, well, you're just not a libertarian if you don't believe in open borders, and this is, you're taking the authoritarian statist position or this.
So just to clarify, that's not where I'm at on this. I'm not saying he's not a libertarian, and I'm not saying that he's being an authoritarian or statist at all. I just think there's some inconsistency here, which is surprising coming from Dave Smith, who is the most consistent guy that you know. Let's just go.
Stuff. And I just want to put this out there one more time. And I think Spike did a good job. I think he did about as good a job as you can do arguing for the open borders position. But here is what I will put out there. And if anyone wants to actually take this on, because there's been a whole bunch of people who are like, I want you to do another debate about immigration or another debate. I want you to debate this person or that person. And I'm like, well, look, I just did this debate. I don't know how much time I actually want to devote to this issue. But if someone wants to take on this, I'll be open to it. But this is essentially my argument. And Rob, you can even, give me feedback and tell me what you think about this. But my essential argument, which I don't think Spike adequately addressed in the debate, although he did a very good job making several points that I think were very important. But my basic argument was this, is that the libertarians who advocate for open borders are taking as a given that government property ought to be open to all comers with no restrictions.
All right. So there is the core of the problem, I think. I think there are two main problems with his argument, and I think he just expressed the first major problem, but we'll let him go for a little bit here.
That if the government controls a piece of property, that therefore, because the government controls it, they can't restrict people from coming into it. That is, if you're
so there may be people who are saying that, and maybe that's what Spike said. I don't know. But that argument that he laid out is that if the government owns something, they have to keep it open for everybody. And he's going to say, well, no, because he's going to go on here a little bit. I'm going to jump ahead for him a little bit because I don't want to lose the train too much here. But he's going to say, like, well, does that mean that anybody who wants to can just walk into a middle school? Which, obviously we don't want that to happen. We don't want some rando dude walking into a middle school. So, therefore close borders, right? So his identification of then, saying that our position would be that if, because the government controls a piece of property, therefore it must be open to whoever. And he's going to say, well, no, we can't have that because we don't want people going to like a middle school or whatever. And so therefore, the libertarian position should be closed borders. He's going to say this is the libertarian position. So this first part might sound like a little bit of a nitpick, but I don't think it is. I think it's just an inconsistency because the libertarian position, as we would understand, I think Dave and I would very much agree on the definition of what libertarianism is. We would go, I think we could agree to define libertarianism according to that Stephan Kinsella article entitled What Libertarianism Is, meaning it's all about private property rights. We would agree that libertarianism, consistent libertarianism, is Rothbardian, it's Hoppian, it's anarcho-capitalist, it's anarchist. So based on that definition of libertarianism, the libertarian position cannot take it as a given that there is any such thing as government property at all. Now, this is where I said earlier, he's right and he's wrong. Because he spent a lot of time before this, and I think he might get into a little bit here, sort of caveating and saying, I'm about to get interrupted by my kids. Hold on just a second. I'll be down in a minute. Go ahead and start without me. Pardon me on that. They're calling me for dinner. They got chili, but I'm going to finish this up first. Trying to figure out where my train of thought was. Let me just, so like the libertarian position doesn't take it as a given that government property exists. Now, I will agree with much of his analysis, and, he's debating Spike Cohen, and he's thinking about, issues related to running for president potentially for the Libertarian Party, which is a position that would be, within the authority of the federal government of the United States of America. And therefore, he's thinking about what the platform is for the Libertarian Party. So, we're dealing with, compromise, and we're dealing with the reality of less than ideal situations. If you understand what I'm saying, we're dealing with, it's that age old thing when it's like anarchy, minarchy. We can sit here and we could talk about, what the ideal anarchist society should be, and we can then, we can talk about, how we deal with what is right now, right? Because the reality is we don't live in an anarchy. We don't live in anything that even looks close to Rothbard's ideas or Hoppe's ideas. We don't live in anything close to that. We could talk about and debate like what that should look like if we ever get there. But, to a lot of what Dave talks about on his channel, we have to think about, like, what do we do with now? And when it comes to that, I don't disagree. I think if, if a government owns, for example, like a middle school, we should want them to operate that middle school within a certain reason, as the same way like a private school would. The problem, of course, as we will very quickly point out, the governments can't run schools the same way private, or they can't run anything the same way a private entity would. That's why we would always want to privatize everything. But until we get to that point, while there are government schools, we should run those, government schools as best we can, as if they are private entities, because, like he's going to point out, we don't want random people running into middle schools. So I think he's right on that point. But I would say the libertarian position still needs to be defined as with respect to what, real libertarianism actually is. And then we could say, our position for, this presidential election, what do we do given the fact that the state exists? Should we have open borders or closed borders in the meantime? We can have a position on that, and it can be closed borders, but I don't think that's the libertarian position. So, all right, I'm going to go on for a little bit because the second issue is going to come up. So let's keep going.
Arguing that, the whole it's just a person crossing a line. Why would some man with a gun, stop them from doing that? If you're taking that argument, then essentially what you're saying is that, well, this is government property and no one can restrict who comes into it or who doesn't.
So again, that's the error right there. I'm not saying anything is government property. I'm saying that not everything is government property, and that a lot of what is government property shouldn't be government property. And so I'm saying the libertarian position is there should be no government property, and therefore there should be no government restricting access to anything. It should be up to the private owner of whatever institution, and the private owner of whatever institution certainly has the right to say, I'm going to bar entry to whoever for any reason they want because it's private property. Certainly, I'm all in favor of that. I love private property. But there should be no government, because government can't really run things the way private institutions do. But going on.
But that does not follow from libertarianism. That if you believe in...
Right, it doesn't. It doesn't follow from libertarianism that we should do anything any particular way with government property, because what follows from libertarianism is that there would not be government property.
Self-ownership and the non-aggression principle and private property rights, it does not follow that because the government has stolen property or stolen tax dollars and then use those tax dollars to, build roads or whatever, or the border area is controlled by the government, that therefore that belongs to everyone of the world equally. Like, that doesn't follow. In the same way that, if someone stole your wallet, Rob, it does not follow that therefore that wallet now belongs to everyone of the world. No, the truth is that that wallet should be returned to you. And if the government has property that it, if taxation is theft and the government is funded by theft, and then the government claims property. Well, who really owns the property rightfully? In a sense, the taxpayers do. You know, it's not just somebody who's never been a part of this country and never, paid anything into it and never been fucked over by this country or anything like that. They don't have the same claim to it that an American citizen does.
So I agree with all that. No problems there at all.
And if you look at the polling, the overwhelming majority, something approaching 90% of Americans, do not support.
I didn't timestamp all of this ahead of time. I apologize. So it's going to be a couple minutes before we get. I'm not sure exactly how long it's going to take him to get to the next thing, but bear with us.
Open borders. So for the government to have open borders, that in itself is not a libertarian position.
Right, because the libertarian position is that the government wouldn't exist. For there to be a government with open borders is a contradiction to the libertarianism because it's fundamentally outside the first principle, right? So you're saying, okay, all right, it's like asking, libertarians, like, I'm a libertarian, I don't think a government should exist, and they're like, well, who would do government things? It's like, well, why do we need government things done, right? And of course, certain things like enforcement of private property rights, somebody would need to do, but it doesn't have to be a state. But digression aside. Point is, he was like, well, I'm obviously when we're using the term government in this particular discussion, we're referring to the state, obviously. So just bearing with that, bearing that in mind, we're referring to the state here. The state should not exist. So when we say, oh, I'm an anarchist, I don't believe the state should exist. And then somebody's like, well, what do we do about all this? What if there's a state government that owns property? And you go, well, how am I supposed to have a position on that? Because my position is the state shouldn't exist. So, I mean, if you want to ask me what, my strategy would be or what I would have the state do while I was the head of its organization, if I became president, what would my position be on, the property that the state owns? Well, obviously, as long as I'm president, the state exists. And so, yeah, I would have closed borders, but I still don't think that in my thinking, I should therefore say, well, the libertarian position is that state property should be closed. State property shouldn't exist.
Like, there's just nothing about that that's libertarian. And there's a couple things I would say, right? So and if anyone wants to take this on, I would be interested in talking to someone about this argument if they
here we go
find a problem with this. But so I'd say that if you're going to argue that once the government takes from the people and anything that is government property, because the government is illegitimate, therefore there should be no restrictions on who enters the government property. And therefore, this should be either unowned or the commons, or just everyone should be allowed in equally. If you're going to apply that principle everywhere, you're going to run into some real problems. All right, guys, let's take a quick moment.
We're skipping this. Skip ahead from the ad.
This is
sorry.
That today.
I should have timestamped this. I wasn't expecting that. I apologize to everybody. How long is this?
Borders. They're very upset about January 6th, but hey, I mean, we gotta have borders on government property, right? I mean, who are you to deny someone their right to walk into the Capitol building whenever they want? But also the examples that I've used before, like anyone should be able to walk into a public school, you know?
Yeah, there you go. Anybody should be able to walk into a public school. So, yeah, so his argument is, if you're going to apply that principle that because the government owns property, anybody should be able to walk into it anywhere, and you're going to apply that everywhere, you're going to run into problems because nobody should be able to walk into a middle school or whatever. We don't want creepy old guys walking into middle schools. Here's the problem with that argument. Again, I said before, I agree with him that I don't want people walking into, I don't want just random guys walking into a middle school, right? I think that there should be certain rules about who can go into middle schools, right? But I don't think it follows from that therefore national borders should be closed to immigration or that crossing national borders should be controlled by the state. And I think it's a very clear reason why I don't think that follows. I think it's a category error. You look at, I'll just lay it out simply. You look at a private school or at a school, right? And it's very easy to say, well, these are the basic property rights rules that we would want that school to follow. And if you sat down and you parse them out, they would be the exact same rules that you would expect to find at the analogous private school. In other words, we're expecting the government to run this school the same way that the private school would be run. That's really ultimately what we want, right? And the reason why we criticize public anything, government run anything, is because government literally can't run things the way that private companies can, or private whatever. Government literally can't run a school as well as a private school for all of the economic reasons. And that's why we oppose all of that, right? But it makes sense to say, yeah, so this school here, you got a building, you've got the land immediately surrounding the building, you've got the equipment, maybe like playground equipment and stuff, you got the parking lot, you've got maybe some sports fields and stuff, you got all the stuff inside the building. This specific plot of land, this specific building, however large it is, it's all contained within a specific area for a specific purpose. And that purpose is education of the schools who attend that, of the students who attend that school. And so, if that's a private entity, all that property would be owned by the company that runs that school. And they therefore would have the private property rights to set whatever access controls they want to on that property. And it's very easy to say, okay, yeah, I mean, it makes sense that we would want anybody going to a public school to have the same controls, because we don't want creepy old guys walking into the girls' locker room, and we don't want, just randos going in and stealing chemistry equipment so they can cook meth with it, Not just because we not have any position one way or another on meth, but because it's counterproductive to the actual business of teaching chemistry if all the equipment keeps going missing. So, yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? And we would say the same for, the Capitol building, right? There should be certain use rules and access rules about people just walking into the U.S. Capitol building, right? Earlier in this episode, Dave Smith's talking about the Capitol riots, and Dave Smith and I, we agree that what happened on January 6, 2021 was not an insurrection. It was not a terrorist attack. Nothing even close to the amount of like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or whatever. All the comparisons that were made last week, and all the outrage by the media and the liberals are just completely fake and nonsensical. But at the same time, in as much as, people accessed that building in ways that were unauthorized and did not follow, protocols and rules and everything about it. Yeah, they committed some sort of property right violations and crimes. They were trespassing. It's ridiculous for people to be as afraid as they were. It was a very low-key, non-violent thing that happened. But the point being, if we're going to have, a government, the government, you could view the state in one way almost as like a monopoly corporation that does certain business, and the business that they do is ruling our lives. But, if we're going to have that corporation, their headquarters building needs to have some sort of security, right? So that they can accomplish the business that they're set about doing, right? And so it makes sense, that building, we would have property rights access controls on, and you can't just have random people go anywhere, any old place they want in that building at any time that they want, because otherwise it's counterproductive to the business of that business doing that corporation doing its business, and we would consider that private property. But here's the issue. When we talk about immigration and we talk about national borders, we're not talking about the same thing. We're not talking about a specific building on a specific piece of land for a specific purpose. We're talking about the state treating the entire country as its property. Now, I know that kind of is de facto what happens. It's kind of de facto what the government and the state does. And again, this is why I think it matters to say what the libertarian position is, because the libertarian position is that is wrong. The government shouldn't do that. The whole idea that I continue to pay property taxes on my house even once I pay my mortgage off, because even after I've bought the house free and clear, which, by the way, I've still got many mortgage payments on my personal mortgage to pay, but there's plenty of people out there who've paid their mortgage off, but they're still paying property taxes. They're still renting their property from the government because the government claims eminent domain over all of the property in the entire country. And every bit of land in this country is technically the property of the government, and that's not the way it should be. The libertarian position is that's not the way it should be, right? So you want to put a national border around the entire country. You're now treating every individual person's private property as being part of that government property now, right? And so that doesn't make sense. There is no private property analogy. There's no analogous private property entity that could or would do that we could then look to say, well, what should be the rules? What should be the property rights rules that make sense to have on a border like that? Private property entities don't go out there and create national borders. Only state governments do that. And so it doesn't make sense to have a state government. Hold on, I'm being interrupted again. We'll be down in a few minutes. I shouldn't try to do this right before dinner. I think I made my point here, right? Right. So at middle school, it makes sense to have a private property right there because a private middle school would have certain rules on their property, and we absolutely agree on why that should be. And so if we have a public school, there shouldn't be a public school. There shouldn't be a public middle school. But yeah, if they exist, and as long as they exist, we should treat them as, property rights. We should have property rights on those properties the same as if they were a private property, because we don't want to have the same problems that we would have if the private middle school didn't have property rights. Same thing with an administrative building for the government. Same thing with, a bank or the Federal Reserve or, whatever. Any property, office buildings, whatever that the government has for the purpose of running their government or whatever. And, they should have, as long as they exist and as long as they're doing their business, we should have the same private property rules that an analogous private sector, privately owned company would have on those properties. And then we should work in the back end to privatize all of those various functions, all of those various things. Privatize the post office. Don't open up post offices to be publicly accessible in every, bit of the post office. Whatever. Don't let the people go in there randomly and do whatever they want in the post office. No, privatize the post office. Don't open up public schools to allow any rando to go into the public school. Privatize the public school, right? What's the analogous private sector entity that would have the national border? There isn't one. That's the problem. That's why the libertarian position is open borders, because there wouldn't be a national border. Now, I agree. There should be private closed borders on the private property of anybody who owns property. And so what if some of that private property is owned by the government? It's still private property within that particular piece of property, like the middle school. But we're treating all of property individually as private property. But there is no entity that legitimately says, I own all the property in the entire country, including the property owned by other individuals. Now, if you want to say, oh, what about the roads? Okay, well, maybe a private company would own the roads, and so the government on those roads. What about open tracts of land? I don't think the government should own all the open tracts of land, and I don't think it would be taken as a given that every open tract of land would be owned by some private individual. Maybe, maybe not. There's a lot of land in this country, though, and so there may be a lot of common land that is not privately owned by somebody. If it was privately owned, whoever owned that particular tract of land, should have private property rules over it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be on that particular tract of land. So maybe there would be a place for an immigrant to come across the border and then enter a town onto any private property where he is invited. The other problem with closed borders is you put closed borders out there and say, well, in this nation, we're closing all of our borders. And now if I live in, El Paso, Texas, and I want to open my private property for people from Mexico to come into my private property, the closed borders position as a state says, no, I'm violating your private property rights and telling you you're not allowed to do that. So you get into some contradictions. You get into some contradictions by having that sort of a policy. And so, yeah, I don't think that national closed borders is a consistent Rothbardian, Hoppian, libertarian position. Because I think referring to, individual private property and saying, well, that therefore, we believe in private property and that people should be able to close their private property borders and therefore the national border should be closed. I think that's too much of a logical disconnect. It's a category error. It doesn't follow. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And so you end up in that position where, again, like if I'm in El Paso and I have property right there on the border and I want to invite Mexicans onto my property, and then the government comes along and says, no. I mean, for the sake of argument, let's assume my property, I don't live in Texas, by the way, I live in Ohio, but let's say my property is right on the state's border. And for a Mexican to come across the state border onto my private property, they would not have to go anywhere else. They go directly from Mexico to my property, right? For the government to say, well, no, you can't do that because you're within America and we have closed America, that violates my property rights. And then it also gets into some ridiculous nonsense, right? We believe in free trade. Who is to say, let's say I live in Mexico. Let's say I live just, across the border from El Paso. And let's say I live like half a mile from El Paso, Texas. And, there's a store right there, right on the border in Texas. Why is this arbitrary line there? Is this a guy crossing an arbitrary line? Yeah. Just because the government drew a line, I can't go half a mile in that direction to go to the store. I have to turn around and go, 5-10 miles in the other direction to go to a different store. That doesn't make sense to me. And it doesn't follow from that to say, well, I should be allowed to go to that store if that store is willing to allow me to go to their store. It doesn't follow from that to say that, therefore, I think that anybody who wants should just go into a middle school anytime that they want. So I see for the most part, I think, Dave Smith and others like him who take the closed borders position, I see where they're coming from. And I think for a lot of things, it makes sense. When it comes to like individual government things, I think, like a middle school, definitely I agree. We should treat that as closed property. But I still doesn't follow from that the national border should be closed. So anyway, I'm going to sign off. I'm going to go get some food. I hope this helps and furthers the discussion. Dave, if you watch this, I doubt it because I got nobody watching me right now. This is brand new, but who knows? So if anybody has any thoughts on that, if it wants to rebut or tell me where I'm wrong, I'm willing to listen to it. But peace.